Podcast Election Edition. I'm Layla, and as always, I'm joined by my brilliant co hosts, Diamond and Zaria. This past presidential election between Vice President Kamala Harris and former twice impeached President Donald Trump turned into quite the ugly fight, leading to the victory of now President elect Trump. How are we feeling post election, ladies?
Yeah, I'm like low key normally like a pessimistic person. So I actually felt optimistic about Kamala's win, and there are many good reasons to be. So I was very surprised by the outcome, and it just shows history is just so full of unexpected shifts, and it's actually just making me so fearful for minorities and for women whose rights to choose is being stripped away.
Yeah, same as Diamond. I was just so disappointed on the day of the election. I was sad and I felt like I was mourning because it was a loss for Black women everywhere who already feel the pressure of having to work twice as hard to get half as much. So, just as Diamond, I'm really fearful for what's to come, but we gonna be all right, y'all.
I feel that. For today's episode, we're diving into the 2024 US presidential election, focusing on how race and ethnicity shaped voting patterns. We'll keep it real, make it funny, but most importantly, break it down for y'all. Ready? Let's get into it. All right, let's start with some numbers from the NBC News exit polls. First up, Black voters showed up strong, as always. 85% supported Kamala Harris. But here's a little twist. Black male support dipped slightly to 77% for Harris, compared to 79% for Biden in the 2020 election. What are y'all's thoughts?
Anti-blackness intersects with gender and ethnicity here. Some black men question Kamala's legitimacy, her mixed race background, and the fact that she's a woman made them hesitate. People also struggle with her identity as a Jamaican black woman, despite her active connections to black Americans and black social groups. Whether through her educational journey at Howard, her membership in a Divine Nine sorority, or even her relationships with her black family members.
Right. And we saw a niche group buying into that rhetoric. It's like if I don't trust her, I'll either not vote or swing the other way, which is just frustrating.
Definitely. And for Black women, it's about resisting both anti Black and patriarchal nonsense. Black women stayed loyal despite the odds.
Of course, black women are the MVPs of democracy every single time.
Okay, shifting to Hispanic and Latino voters. Overall, Latino voters across the nation voted majorly for Kamala Harris, but in key states like Florida, 58% of the Latino vote went for Trump, with Cuban Americans leading that charge at 70% voting for Trump. Zaria, what's your take?
Listen, Gene Demby's article on the census who checks Hispanic, who checks white, and why hits on this. Hispanic identity is complex. Different communities prioritize different things. And many Cubans in Florida, a key state, identify with whiteness and integrate into white and often conservative social spaces to gain proximity and the benefits of white privilege.
Now for Asian and Middle Eastern voters. Asian support for Harris was at 54%, but Middle Eastern voters in Michigan was a different story. The Council on American Islamic Relations collected post election data that showed a sharp drop in Democratic support from 2020 to 2024, with only 20% of respondents reporting that their support for Kamala Harris in 2024, in comparison to 69% who backed Biden in the same 2020 exit poll.
The Israel Palestine conflict played a huge role. Groups like the Uncommitted Movement called out the Democratic Party's foreign policy.
Absolutely. For the help of our listeners, the Uncommitted Movement is a group of Middle Eastern organizers who are aiming to hold the Democratic Party accountable for its support of harmful foreign policies and warn of the potential loss of the voter base for the party. They offered to endorse Harris in exchange for a platform to speak on the plight of Palestinians during this ongoing Israeli genocide at the DNC, but their requests were rejected.
And let's not forget the historical context. The war on terror era and Islamophobia alienated these communities from the GOP at the turn of the century. Steve Garner and Zahir Saloyev's work on the racialization of Muslims explains this dynamic so well. Middle Easterners and Muslims have been lumped together and have been the targets of racist torment under the guise of protecting our country from terrorism. Since then, the Middle Eastern voting base has been blue party loyalists, but all of that can change.
For sure. Finally, white voters. 50% went for Trump, and white women, 53% in key states backed him. I think this shows how Trump's fear provoking rhetoric about the threat of non whites replacing white people in America because of minority population growth and immigration from non white countries, and the country being overrun with quote unquote foreigners and criminals really scared white people in this election.
It's the same old fear tactics. Immigrants are criminals, minorities are taking over. It's the fear factor Barbara Combs talks about. It goes beyond just anti blackness to stoke fear of criminal black people who need to be locked up and contained, in addition to xenophobic fear of immigrants, especially from the global south and the Middle East coming in and taking jobs and committing violent or drug related crimes.
Right. Supporting these policies keeps racism alive and well, even if it's framed as traditional values and safety concerns. It also makes me think of pushback. These fears are provoking violence among white people, sometimes literal but also systemic, through voting in leaders who establish violent policies that will harm and subdue communities of color.
I agree. If we keep in step with Harris Combs policy recommendation number 5, we should aim to explicitly recognize that racism is deeply ingrained in our society and its systems. Supporting policies, legislations, behavior, and practices that uphold racist ideologies and inequalities means contributing to the continuity of racism in this country. Now, let's shift gears and explore some theories behind these numbers. First, the racial formation theory is based on the racial formation theory in the United States by Michael Omi and Howard Winant.
This theory shows how political, social, and economic forces shape racial identities. In this election, Harris was framed as not black enough and too progressive, which influenced how different groups saw her. Trump constantly made comments about her race, questioning her blackness because of her intersectional identities. I think this rhetoric about her being unfit and blaming current social problems on her were related to her gender, but also showed how incompetence and laughter or joking are seen as being related to her blackness. They connect with her being unserious, unfit, goofy, or dumb. Her actions are racialized and connected to her inability to perform within the job.
And Trump's campaign lead into that. Divide and conquer, right?
Exactly. Let's talk about optional ethnicity by Mary Waters. Diamond, you want to take this?
Sure, optional ethnicity means some groups can choose when to emphasize their ethnic identity. For example, a white Irish voter can celebrate St. Patrick's Day and express their ethnic identity without having to worry about how their whiteness or Irishness affects their life outcomes. Black and Asian people can't say the same. I think it's even shown in how Kamala's identity as a Black Jamaican and a Tamil South Asian had impacts on her perception during her campaign. Some Black Americans question her Blackness because of her father's Jamaican ethnic background, thinking, is she really Black?
It's like a political buffet. Pick and choose what fits the narrative that we're trying to spin.
And finally, Vanilla Silva's colorblind racism. It's all about perpetuating pretending race doesn't matter, which just upholds the ideologies and systems that perpetuate racism and racial inequality. For example, voters say they picked Trump because he'll fix the economy, while ignoring his racist rhetoric. Minimization, naturalization, abstract liberalism, and cultural racism. The four frames of colorblind racism shield systemic issues from critique by portraying our society as this post racial, non racist world.
Yes, color blindness makes people feel progressive without challenging systemic racism.
The four frames of colorblind racism allow white people to make sense of racial inequalities while denying the ways they actively contribute to it. White Trump voters who may not be overtly racist are able to rationalize their decisions by suggesting that in America, everyone has the same opportunities to pursue the American dream, as we see in abstract liberalism, and a minimization that racist discrimination is no longer an issue that affects life outcomes for people of color. They can also make certain exclusionary practices seem innate or biological by assuming that people of races just happen to like living in the same areas, as asserted in naturalization. A big one for the Trump camp is cultural racism. They blame social issues on the supposed group behaviors and practices. For example, they might say Black people don't value education, so of course they don't get into top schools and excel in higher level and higher paying jobs. This is a better lie for them to tell themselves instead of confronting the social barriers that keep us from progressing. Let's bring it home with a look at voter suppression. What stood out to you two this year?
Georgia was a big one this year. Those strict voter ID laws hit black voters and students at black institutions in the Atlanta area.
I definitely noticed a social media graphic around election season that showed how Georgia polling locations don't accept student IDs from private institutions. Crazy how PWIs like the University of Georgia and Georgia Southern can use their student IDs at the polls, but students at private state institutions like I don't know, Morehouse and Spelman and Clark and Payne and Morris Brown can't. Hmm. It's almost if they don't want AUC and Georgia HBCU students as a whole to vote. Weird.
And in Arizona, indigenous voters faced huge challenges because polling places were so far away from their communities. Long polling lines also plagued lots of voting stations. We've got to find a way to secure voting rights in our democracy.
All right, y'all. That's a wrap for this episode of Let's Talk About Race podcast, Election Edition. We broke down the numbers, connected the dots, and called out the nonsense. Zaria, Diamond, any final thoughts?
Just this, if you don't see how race shapes everything, you're not paying attention.
And to communities of color, we have to keep organizing and keep fighting to save our democracy.
All right, y'all. We want to hear from you. What surprised you most about this election? Drop a comment, share this episode with your crew, and stay tuned for our next one. Thanks for listening to Let's Talk About Race podcast, Election Edition. Bye.